United spent tens of millions of dollars trying to force American out of Chicago O'Hare. It bought a collapsed rival's last gates. It flooded the airport with flights nobody needed. And by 2026, American had more gates than before the fight ever started. That is not a typo. The airline that tried to push its rival out ended up handing it ground instead. United's own CEO had told investors American was losing close to $1 billion a year at O'Hare. While United made $500 million, American called that number unsubstantiated, and outside analysts said nobody had shown the math. But the real story is not the dollar dispute. It is that United's campaign to expand at O'Hare's expense is exactly what triggered a federal cap that ended up cutting United's own schedule 5 times deeper than American's. This is how you spend tens of millions of dollars and still come out behind. O'Hare has always been an unusual airport, and that's exactly what United decided to test. Most of America's big hubs belong to one airline outright, and for good reason. A single dominant carrier can build its schedule around tight connection banks, hold gate space without negotiating for it every year, and set fares with almost no local competitor pushing back. Atlanta belongs to Delta, Charlotte to American, and Denver and Houston both answer to United. O'Hare is the exception. 2 full-size hubs, United and American, stacked on top of each other at the same airport, sharing the same runways, the same taxiways, and, critically, the same finite set of gates. Neither airline can plan its schedule in isolation, because every gate one carrier holds is a gate the other doesn't, and a single missing gate can be the difference between a connection that works and one that doesn't for thousands of passengers a day. For most of the last 2 decades, that arrangement held, uneasily but workably, because neither airline had a strong enough reason to break it, and because breaking it meant picking a fight neither side was sure it could win outright. Fights like this aren't unique to Chicago. Airlines have used gate leases and schedule floods to squeeze rivals out of shared hubs before, because a gate a competitor can't get is cheaper to hold than a fare war. A competitor can still win. What makes O'Hare different is how publicly the federal government was willing to step in and cap the fight by regulation, rather than let 2 airlines exhaust each other, and how fast the numbers ended up working against the side that pushed hardest. For a regular passenger, none of that boardroom maneuvering is visible at the gate. It shows up as a slightly longer walk to a connecting flight, a departure time that shifts a few minutes earlier or later than it used to, or a direct route that quietly stops running because the airline that used to fly it lost the gate to fly it from. Then the pandemic hit both airlines, but not equally. American came out the other side carrying tens of billions of dollars in debt, a route network it had trimmed back further than it wanted to, and aircraft it had retired early just to conserve cash. Rebuilding that network back to its old size was always going to take years, not quarters. United restructured faster, cut costs harder, and came out leaner, with more room on its own balance sheet to spend on offense instead of just defense. By the time travel demand fully recovered, United had something at O'Hare it hadn't really had before: room to push, and a rival that was financially in no position to push back as hard. Gates at a constrained airport like O'Hare aren't handed out once and forgotten. The city recalculates who gets what almost every year, based on how much of the airport's total capacity each airline actually flew the year before, a system built around linear footage of terminal frontage, not a fixed number of doors. It functions less like owning property and more like a lease that gets rewritten annually, which means every schedule decision an airline makes today doubles as a bid for next year's gate map. In 2025, that annual rewrite broke hard for United. It picked up 5 additional gates. American lost 4. The city ran that recalculation a full year earlier than its own lease terms technically allowed for, and multiple reports at the time connected the early timing to a very specific civic anxiety: that United, Chicago's own hometown carrier, might relocate its headquarters to Denver if it didn't feel sufficiently prioritized in its own city. American sued over the timing, arguing the early recalculation broke the airport's own rules. The case went nowhere fast, and United kept the gates. That alone would have been a decisive win. United didn't stop there. Only weeks after Spirit Airlines collapsed on May 2, 2026, ending 33 years of ultra-low-cost flying, United and American both moved on what Spirit left behind at O'Hare. Spirit's end had been building for months. The airline had already filed for bankruptcy twice since 2024, and in the weeks before it shut down, it had been negotiating with the White House for a $500 million bailout that never came together. Money that would have kept a smaller version of the airline flying instead of forcing a full liquidation. Rising jet fuel costs that year, driven in part by the conflict with Iran, hit Spirit especially hard, because unlike the legacy carriers, it had no premium cabin and no basic economy fare of its own to offset the cost. Rock-bottom pricing was the entire business, and rock-bottom pricing leaves no room to absorb a fuel shock. Its U.S. market share had fallen from just over 5% to under 4% in a single year, and analysts projected it would keep falling to under 2% by that May, a slide that would have left the airline that once called itself America's largest ultra-low-cost carrier ranked 9th in the country. In the days around the shutdown, the last 31 Spirit flights scheduled out of O'Hare were canceled, and other carriers moved to fill at least some of the 14 destinations it used to fly non-stop from Chicago. Before that final shutdown, Spirit had already sold off its most valuable O'Hare asset, 4 preferential gates in the airport's G concourse that it no longer had the schedule to justify. Selling gates ahead of selling the whole airline is standard practice in an airline bankruptcy. A terminal gate at a slot-constrained hub is often worth more to a rival still flying than to a liquidating estate, and creditors get paid faster from cash than from an asset nobody's left to use. American bought 2 of them for around $30 million, a deal finalized in bankruptcy court in December 2025. For a landlocked airport with no room left to pour new concrete for extra gates, $30 million for 2 that already existed isn't an inflated price. It's simply what that kind of scarcity costs. United came back for the other 2 in February 2026, agreeing to pay roughly $30 million more. On paper, that split looked even, 2 gates each, about $30 million each. Even after the sale, Spirit kept a reduced schedule running out of O'Hare for a few more months, flying from the airport's shared common-use gates rather than the ones it had just sold, limping along on borrowed space until there was no schedule left to fly. It wasn't quite that clean, either. Buried in United's own internal memo, explaining the purchase to its employees was a detail that never made the headlines. Of the 2 gates United was buying, only one would stay with United for the long term. The other was already scheduled to go straight back to the city for reassignment at the end of September 2026, a gate United paid millions of dollars for and would barely get to keep. That reversion clause never made a single headline when the sale closed, buried on page 4 of a bankruptcy filing most coverage never opened. If you want the next buried detail when we find it, that's what subscribing gets you. Buying gates is only half of how you fight for territory at a hub like this. The other half is simpler and uglier. By most accounts of how these fights work, you fly planes nobody needs, on routes that don't need them, largely to keep a rival from claiming that space. In practice, that can mean adding a 4th or 5th daily flight on a route that already had enough seats, or restarting a route too thin to turn a profit on its own, just so the gate stays occupied by your own aircraft instead of sitting open for a competitor to grab. That is what flooding a hub actually means, and it isn't incompetence. It's a bet that today's loss buys tomorrow's territory, the same logic that let United justify absorbing real financial pain at O'Hare while insisting the long game was worth it. Heading into summer 2026, United scheduled that record 750 flights a day out of O'Hare, 200 more than American planned at the same airport, and by several trade press accounts, the largest single airline schedule O'Hare had ever seen. American, for its part, was finally rebuilding capacity it had let shrink after the pandemic, adding 100 new daily departures of its own, close to 30% more than the year before. Real network growth, restoring roughly what it used to fly before 2020, not a territorial gesture. Why fight this hard over gates specifically, rather than just competing on routes and fares? Because at O'Hare, gate space is the one input that both directly limits how big an airline can grow and quietly drives one of its most profitable side businesses, co-branded credit cards. Airlines make outsized margin on loyalty and card spending in the markets where they're the dominant carrier, and Chicago is one of the largest such markets in the country. Losing gate share at O'Hare doesn't just mean fewer seats to sell. It means ceding a city's worth of premium credit card customers to the airline that stayed bigger. American has publicly rejected the idea that it was ceding any of that ground, pointing to the same loyalty and card revenue as its own real prize, and insisting Chicago was never a market it intended to shrink out of, whatever United's flight count did to the schedule. That's the stake neither airline was willing to concede on paper, whatever the actual flight economics looked like underneath it. O'Hare could not physically absorb both airlines' plans at once. Two sets of intersecting runways, unpredictable Midwest weather, and now more than 3,000 scheduled daily flights pushed the airport's air traffic control past what it could reliably manage, the kind of overload that turns one delayed inbound flight into a cascade of missed connections across the whole afternoon. The Federal Aviation Administration stepped in and did something it rarely does to an airport this size. It imposed a hard legal cap of 2,708 flights a day, in effect from mid-May through late October of 2026, with at least one trade report suggesting the restriction could stretch into 2027, though the FAA has not made that extension official. Every airline flying out of O'Hare had to cut something, but the cuts weren't distributed evenly because they were sized to each airline's own overreach. United, which had scheduled the most excess capacity, had to cut about 200 flights a day from its plan. American, which had scheduled growth closer to what the airport could actually support, had to cut roughly 40. Run the numbers against each airline's own plan and the gap gets sharper. United had to scrap roughly 1 out of every 4 flights it had scheduled before a single one of them ever took off. American lost closer to 1 flight in 12. The same law that was meant to referee a fight between two roughly equal rivals ended up punishing the airline that had pushed hardest to win it. That's the part of this story most coverage buried in a single paragraph. If that's a surprise, send it to someone who flies through O'Hare and thinks this fight is still one-sided. By October 2026, when the city drew its next annual gate map, the numbers told a story neither airline had been planning for. American was set to regain 3 of the gates it had lost in the earlier reassignment. Combined with the 2 gates it had bought from Spirit, American came out of the entire 18-month fight with 1 more gate at O'Hare than it held before any of this began. An airline that had spent most of 2 years playing defense somehow finishing with a bigger footprint than when the fight started. United still finished ahead on paper, up 2 gates net once its own Spirit purchase and its earlier reassignment win are added together. But that was a fraction of the outright dominance it had been building toward, and one of its 2 new Spirit gates was already scheduled to leave its hands within months of buying it. One aviation journalist who had tracked the fight from its first public shot summed up the actual scoreboard bluntly. Plenty of trolling, but nowhere close to the monopoly United had set out to build. 2 years of gate purchases, lawsuits, and an oversized schedule had produced a net result smaller than a single ordinary lease renewal. None of this shows up as a headline most flyers will ever read. It shows up as which gate you walk to, how far your connection runs, whether the airline you've always flown still has the same reach in Chicago it used to have, and whether next year's connection time gets longer or shorter because of a gate map most passengers will never see. But behind that ordinary inconvenience sits an 18-month campaign that cost real money and delivered less than it promised. By most outside accounts, United set out to make Chicago its city alone. Instead, it spent tens of millions of dollars, triggered a federal regulatory response that landed hardest on its own overreach, and handed its rival a net gain in the one-currency gate space that started this entire fight. The gate United paid for and has to give back this September is still sitting there, unassigned, waiting for the next round of a fight that, on the numbers so far, United has already lost more of than it's won. Whoever the city hands that gate to next will tell you almost everything about who actually came out ahead in Chicago, and it's worth watching for. If you want to see who actually ends up with that gate when it goes back to the city, subscribe so you do not miss it, and let us know in the comments which hub war you want covered next.